Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Hey, let me remind you again of a couple of things before I get into the video this morning. Number one, our Preterist Pilgrim Weekend. This is a get-together that we have been sponsoring now for 15, 16, 17 years. It is a get-together of people of like mind who have a deep and sincere and zealous love of the truth. And our theme for our seminar this year is the book of Revelation. We got a fantastic lineup of speakers. It will be held at the Ardmore Convention Center, and we will be posting details about it on both of my websites, donkpreston.com or bibleprophecy.com. But that is July 9th, 10th, and 11th. And we're going to be covering a wide range of topics. I suspect that this year will be version 1. I suspect that next year we'll have to continue our study of the book of Revelation. But I want to invite you to do that. Now, if you can't come, if you cannot attend, we will be offering a live stream video of the entire conference. Now, needless to say, that's a little bit expensive. For us to do that, we have to bring somebody in. I don't have anybody local that can handle that for me. So we have to pay to bring somebody in who has all of the equipment, travel expense, this and that and the other. And so even though we offer this service free, we encourage people to give us a love offering to help out with the expense of bringing someone in. And we always appreciate whatever help that can be given for us to bring this service to you. And again, it's not mandatory that you offer a gift, all right? But if you appreciate what we're doing, if you appreciate the messages, and if you want to help us to keep doing this, to being able to bring this kind of event to you, then any contribution, any gift that you can give to us would be greatly appreciated. And by the way, for those in the continental U.S. who are, American citizens having to pay tax, any gift that you give to us is tax exempt. So please keep that in mind. Again, that's July 9th, 10th, and 11th, Ardmore, Oklahoma, Ardmore Convention Center. Again, the details will be posted on my websites, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com. In the very near future, we're already getting registrations in. Now, we got plenty of room, all right? Lots and lots of room. And I have to tell you something. The fellowship, the enthusiasm, the excitement of people who come from literally everywhere. I think our record so far is that we have had attendees here from 36 states. That tells you about how dedicated people are, how excited they are about the message of fulfillment and the spread of God's kingdom. I tell you, it's just an absolutely fantastic time of fellowship. So come be with us July 9th, 10th, and 11th, Ardmore, Oklahoma, at the Ardmore Convention Center. If you have any questions that you would like to ask about details, about hotels, and yes, we do make arrangements for local hotels to give discounted rates for those who attend our conference. So if you have any questions, please contact me, go to my websites, and send me an email and say, okay, how do I register? What are the hotel rates, etc., etc. And we'll put you in contact with the appropriate people. Also, do not want to forget this. I want to encourage you once again to be able to go to my websites, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com, and avail yourselves of all of the tremendous, tremendous numbers of absolutely free materials that are there, articles. I mean, hundreds upon hundreds of articles on various topics concerning the last days, not only written by me, but written also by men that I trust, that I feel are great Bible students who have a great deal to offer in regard to the fulfillment of God's promises. And so, look, there's no cost to log in, all right? You go there, And there's a search bar. If you're looking to do, for instance, I've been contacted over and over and over lately about whether or not I've written any articles on Zechariah 12 through 14. Well, as a matter of fact, I've written an entire series of articles on Zechariah chapters 12 through 14. And so all you have to do is go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com, and do a search. Zechariah 12 through 14, Zechariah 14, etc. And you will find there an entire list of articles that I have written. And obviously, in addition to all of that, you will find book after book after book. I've personally written over 31 books on the subject of fulfilled eschatology. And if you live, by the way, out of the continental U.S., and you would like to avail yourselves of some of my books, but you understand that shipping is exorbitantly expensive, and I understand that, okay? But if you'd like a PDF copy of any of my books at a greatly reduced price, generally it's at least 50% off of the retail price for the paperback copy, hey, just contact me and say, I'd like a PDF copy of the following book, and we'll help you make that purchase, all right? So, with that said, I want to pick up where I've been leaving off. I want to pick up with an examination of the Transfiguration as proof positive that when Jesus said, the Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father with his angels and shall reward every man according as his works. And verily I say unto you, there are some standing here which shall not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Well, I've been presenting to you that that's the challenge of Christ. Remember, Jesus said, do not believe me for my words' sake, believe me for my works' sake. If I do not do the works which the Father has given me, do not believe me. Have you really seriously examined that challenge in the light of his prediction of Matthew 16, 27 and 28? Let me remind you that the Jews, the Muslims, and the atheists, and the agnostics, they all point to passages like this, and they say, Jesus very clearly said he was coming back at the end of human history, they tell us. In that generation, he did not do it. Therefore, he failed. He cannot be the Son of God. He cannot be the Savior of men. The Bible cannot be inspired. But I've shared with you video after video after video about what Jesus meant when he said he was coming in the glory of the Father, that he was going to judge as he had seen the Father judge, John 5, 21 and following. Well, listen, folks, he had never, ever, ever seen the Father come out of heaven on a literal cloud with the literal sound of a trumpet, with the literal, flaming fire and angels, and had never literally destroyed physical heaven and earth. Now, the Old Testament, if you'll remember, describes the coming of Yahweh in the Old Testament in those very terms. But that language is highly metaphoric. It is hyperbole, exaggerated language to describe God's intervention into history, not to end history. So I want you, please, avail yourself of the multitudinous free articles on my website. Purchase some of the books, particularly the book, The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat, the very first full preterist commentary on 2 Peter chapter 3 that I'm aware of. All right? Avail yourself of that. And I'll guarantee you, you will find the evidence to be absolutely incredibly overwhelming. Now, with that said, people point to the Transfiguration, and they say, well, yes, Jesus said, some standing here shall not pass away or shall not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming. Well, 6 days later, the apostles saw the Transfiguration. Well, let me remind you one more time that the language of Matthew 16, 27 and 28 does not allow the transfiguration to be the fulfillment of Jesus' words. Keep in mind, one more time, Jesus was speaking to a large multitude of people. And he said, some standing here. We cannot possibly imagine a scenario in which only a few people out of that large multitude lived for 6 days or 8 days. It is inconceivable to imagine a scenario in which only a handful of that large multitude lived for another 18 months. For Jesus to be speaking of the day of Pentecost, for instance. I'm sorry, folks. None of those scenarios work. But you see, Peter in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 16 and following, appealed to the transfiguration as absolutely proof positive of the coming of Christ. We have not followed cunningly devised fables when we made known to you the power and the parousia of the Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of His glory, for we were with Him on the mount when that voice came from heaven saying, "This is my beloved Son." Therefore, we have the prophetic word made more sure. Now watch this. Jesus said He was coming in the lifetime of that generation. Peter said the vision on the mount made the prophetic word more sure, confirmed it, nailed it down, that it was going to happen. Oh, and by the way, let's not forget that in his very first epistle, Peter said Christ was ready to be revealed. He said He was ready to judge the living and the dead. He said the end of all things had drawn near. And he said the time had come for the judgment. See? So people appeal to the transfiguration. And they say that's the fulfillment of Jesus' predictions. Well, I tell you what, this may seem a little bit of a digression, but it's not really. If it's the case that the transfiguration was a vision of the second coming of Christ, and it is obviously true that that's what it is. You know, it's absolutely stunningly amazing to me that there are some folks who are former preterists, all right? They once believed that Christ came in AD 70. But because they place more emphasis, literally, on the early church writers, what they call the early church fathers, because they place so much emphasis on those patristic writers, and they they literally place more emphasis and more authority. Now they deny it, but in the final analysis they do. Because they place more authority on what those early church writers said than they do the Bible itself. Here's what they do. This is something amazing. They jump up, and one notable ex-preterist who once admitted, who once taught that the transfiguration was in fact a vision of the second coming, he now says, well, you know, it wasn't really a vision of Christ's second coming. The word parousia can mean presence. Well, it can. But as one scholar after another, and the tremendous scholarly consensus throughout the ages, and here comes the irony, folks. Pay very close attention to what I'm about to say. The virtual consensus of scholarship and of church history throughout the entirety of Christianity is that the transfiguration was a vision of Christ's second coming. So, what we have now, here's the irony, is we have men who are former preterists. They once admitted that yes, church history, yes, the patristics, yes, the scholarly consensus is that the transfiguration was a vision of the second coming, but now these former preterists, they know the power of admitting that. They realize the danger of admitting that, and we'll show you why it's a danger to them here momentarily. So what do? They now say, no, 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 the transfiguration was not a vision of the second coming. It was just a vision of Christ's presence with them. Folks, they didn't need a vision of Christ's presence among them. He was right there. He had been with them for almost 3 years. They didn't need a vision of His incarnation. Do you see how desperate people can become? And to suggest that the transfiguration was not a vision of Christ's parousia, but rather just a vision of Jesus' presence, demands that we explain His transfiguration. Hey, look, if it was just a vision of His incarnation in the flesh as a 5'5" Jewish man did not resemble what He appeared like on the Mount of Transfiguration. There's no resemblance whatsoever. His face shined like the sun. His clothes shined whiter than anything that man could do. That's not a vision of His incarnation. That's not a vision of His presence among them in His humility. And again, I mean, it's just beyond amazing. The arguments, if you want to call it an actual argument, that some people come up with to try to explain away the power of the transfiguration. Peter said that the transfiguration made the prophetic word of the prediction of the coming of the Lord. Made that more sure. Now, so let me ask you a question. If the transfiguration was not a vision of the second coming, number one, it was not a vision of His incarnation. Number two, the transfiguration was not a vision of Jesus' resurrection. Number three, the transfiguration was not a vision of Jesus' ascension to the Father. That happened in Acts chapter 1. I mean, let's face it, folks. What Jesus looked like in Acts chapter 1, 9-11, did not resemble in any way, shape, form, or fashion what He looked like on the Mount of Transfiguration. You see that problem? It's a massive problem. So, here we have the transfiguration as proof positive of Christ's parousia. His parousia, once again, that could not be His incarnation, that could not be His resurrection, that could not be His ascension. Well, what of the parousia of Christ is there? His second coming. So ask yourself this question. Since the transfiguration was a vision of the second coming, that would prove, would it not? That would confirm, would it not, the prophetic word of Matthew 16, 27, 28. But let me ask you this question. If the transfiguration was not a vision of the second coming, but was a vision of something entirely unrelated to the second coming, then how would the vision of an event, of an event unrelated to the second coming prove and confirm the reality of the second coming? You see, that would be something like me saying, I own a 68 Mustang GT390 4-speed fastback. And somebody says, well, how do I know you own that? And I would respond, well, because I voted in the last election. You see how silly that is? There's no connection. There's no relationship. And so once again, to say and to claim, as some former preterists are doing, that the transfiguration was not a vision of the second coming, it was a vision of something unrelated to the second coming, is in effect to say that the vision of the transfiguration was a vision of something having no relationship to the second coming, and yet it somehow proves that the second coming would occur. Was Peter that bad of an arguer, of a polemicist, of a debater? Was Peter that illogical as to say, now look, I got to tell you what, folks, I'm presenting to you, and I have preached to you the second coming of Christ. And when we made known to you the second coming of Christ, we were not making it up. It was not a myth. It was not a fable. But I want to tell you something. We saw His power and His parousia on the mountain. Pardon me. And when we saw it, what we saw proves our message of the preaching of the second coming, drives it home, establishes it, proves it beyond a shadow of a doubt. All right. So, the Transfiguration was a vision of the second coming. Let me ask you, therefore, to consider the following. In the Transfiguration, oh, by the way, very quickly, I wrote a book entitled Like Father, Like Son, on Clouds of Glory. The book can be found on my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com. Like Father, Like Son, on Clouds of Glory. In that book, I have an extensive discussion of the Transfiguration of Christ and how it proves the second coming, how it proves the second coming was to be in the first century, and therefore proves the proper definition and the proper nature of the second coming. And here's part of what I mean. On the Mount of Transfiguration, what was it that the disciples, in that vision of the second coming, what was it that they actually saw? Now, let's examine the traditional view of eschatology very quickly. What does the traditional view of eschatology tell us that the second coming is all about? Well, number one, it's the end of human history. Number two, it's the destruction of heaven and earth. Number three, it's the time of the physical raising of human corpses of every human being who has ever lived in the entire history of mankind, are miraculously reconstituted, regenerated, raised, resurrected, and brought back to life. So that's the traditional view of the second coming. So let me ask you a question. When you go to Matthew chapter 17, parallel of Mark 9, Luke 9, do you find there a single mention of the end of time? And oh, by the way, the traditional view of eschatology, the traditional view of the second coming, is it's the time of the end of the gospel of Jesus Christ. But consider this. Jesus said, my word, that's the gospel, will never pass away. Well, the traditional view of eschatology says, well, yes, it will pass away because at the end of time, there's no more evangelism. And so therefore the gospel of Christ ceases to function. Well, that's a direct violation of Jesus' words. My word will never pass away. Tradition says the gospel will pass away because the gospel will cease to function. Folks, there's something wrong with any eschatology that says the gospel of Christ will one day cease to function. Okay, so is there a single word in Matthew chapter 17 about the end of time? Let me encourage you. Let me challenge you. Your homework between now and next week is to read Matthew 17, Mark 9, Luke 9, and see if you can find any kind of a reference to the end of time. Number two, see if you can find any reference whatsoever to the end of the gospel. any reference at all to the cessation of the gospel's function. See if you can find that there. Okay? Number 3, see if you can find any reference, any mention, any indication of the destruction of literal, physical heaven and earth. See if you can find there any reference whatsoever to the raising of literal, physical, human corpses out of the ground. Now, remember, that's what traditional eschatology says will happen at the end of the current age. Now, again, this is such a simple but such a profound point. The Bible affirms that the current Christian age has no end. Okay? So, here's the traditional view of eschatology. And it says the current age, which is the Christian age, will come to an end at the so-called end of time. The Bible says the Christian age has no end. So, you know, folks, we got to make up our mind here. Who are we going to accept? And make no mistake, I know how difficult it is to change our traditional concepts. I was raised believing that time will end. I was raised believing that the Christian age will come to an end. I was raised believing that literal physical heaven and earth is going to be destroyed. I was raised believing that every dead human corpse is going to be raised out of the dirt, out of the dust, and be brought back to life. That's what I was raised believing. But again, let me remind you, and again, your homework is, read those passages, Matthew 17, Mark 9, Luke 9, and see if you can find any reference to the end of time, the end of the Christian age, the destruction of heaven and earth, and the resurrection of human bodies. I'm telling you, you can't find it there. We'll continue our discussion next week.